worst form of government, except all the others that have ever been tried. I think that that democracy is messy and ugly and not to be examined closely by someone whose stomach is not very strong. We see that constantly. And yet, it beats the alternatives, so we put it in the democratic system, knowing that there's a decent chance that you won't get a good policy outcome. But I think, and this frankly is more a matter of faith than a matter of empirically proven conclusion, I believe, maybe doing what I do, I have to believe, that the more people who've looked at it, who've examined it, who've studied it, who are able to testify about it, who are able to bring lawsuits about it, to get political movements going about it, the more likely we are to have a better result. That ultimately an informed citizenry is no guarantee of successful policy, but is positively correlated with successful policy. So it's not a deeply satisfying answer. I certainly am not the right person to make these decisions. We throw it into the democratic process, and if enough people know enough about it, we hope for a good result. And the more people know, the more realistic our hopes may be. Yes?
Along the same lines, do you have any idea of what you think, sort of looking at political and social climates nowadays, what the popular reaction to these kinds of things would be? On the one hand, you mentioned that we're looking at criminals, particularly criminals who have probably done fairly heinous things, so people might be in favor of them having some sort of painful or potentially harmful thing inflicted on them. But on the other side, we know how leery sort of people in general are of things that can change your brain. So
Yep.
do you think that this is something that there would be a lot of support for, these sorts of interventions, or do you think the public would be?
I think this will be relatively polarizing. I think some people would support it quite strongly, whether or not there was proof of safety or efficacy. And I think other people would oppose it quite strongly, whether or not there was proof of safety or efficacy. People who shop in organic grocery stores probably aren't going to be very keen on direct brain interventions, would be my guess. I think there's sort of a suspicion of science, naturalist, I'll say environmentalists. I don't mean to imply that all environmentalists, or even many, have this view, but there's sort of a left opposition to technology. There's a right opposition and maybe a religiously based set that also would be quite concerned about this. But then a lot of people, if you say, we're going to make you safer, will jump at it, particularly if they think it can never involve them or their children. So, again, I come back to this Wallenstein book. I've just read this one. I read the one on lobotomy, Great and Desperate Cures, a few months ago. This Brain Control, long out of print, 1973. He actually talks about that. He says, so would people would find abhorrent the idea of putting electrodes in people to change their behavior. But, he says, if they thought it worked, the abhorrence would likely disappear. Now, that was before we started doing deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. But Parkinson's patients don't seem to be terrified or disgusted or revolted by the idea of having an electrode in their brains, as long as they think it's going to do something that will help them, and for many of them it does. We get used to lots of things. Lots of things that were abhorrent, even within my lifetime, let alone within the last century, are now either accepted or in some cases viewed as rights. So, yeah, I think there would be a lot of mixed reaction, but that mixed reaction is a dynamic thing, and some of it will change with experience and some belief that it actually works. Yes?
Well, do you think, though, with the development of treating criminals this way, kind of the way some studies have been with psychopaths, that this kind of, instead of seeing this person as doing a criminal behavior, it's like this is going to turn into a disease or some kind of be more like a treatment that they would get from a doctor, and would you envision this kind of separation happening?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. So, this argument about, and we've seen it with some things like alcoholism moving from sin to disease in some people's minds. And I think the availability of a treatment that looks medical or is medical in basis is likely to push people to think of something more as a disease. If you can treat it with something that looks medical, then it must have been a disease, will be the jump people make. Will that make, what I don't know, though, is will it make any difference? As long as we, I think, take psychopaths for an example. Let's say everyone decides psychopathy is real and psychopaths are victims of this mental illness. They're the first and biggest victim. We should feel sorry for them, etc. But we're still going to try to prevent them from hurting other people. So ultimately, whether we do this through a criminal sanction that says you are a bad person and we are going to punish you and society is going to look down its nose at you, versus you are a sick person and we feel terribly sorry for you and we are going to intervene in a way that protects society from you, I think those are different worlds. How importantly different, I don't know. And I think there's likely to be a fair amount of controversy about that. But I do think you're right in your instinct. To the extent there become medical-like treatments or interventions that we will call treatments, that's more likely to make people think of what's being treated as a disease. I just don't know what would follow from that shift. Susan.
To get your
Dr. Rushing, sorry.
On what I see is sort of a glitch in the system. So in order to prove that something is safe and effective, you actually have to do research on that. So if we're looking at
gasp.
violence in prisoners, the existence of the common rule has made it very difficult to actually conduct research on prisoners. And even if you can get a proposed research study through an IRB, finding someone to fund that study, I have found, is nearly impossible.
Yep.
So how are we going to, get the research that's necessary to prove and to even investigate whether some of these things would be safe or effective if the populations that we want to test on were excluded from?
In a way, this goes back to her question. What's the greatest single source of research funding for things involving biology? The National Institutes of Health. So if you can call something health, you can get research funding for it. But NIH is in the business of health. There are people, public health people might say crime is part of health, but NIH will have trouble selling that to Congress. I think that this is a big problem. We see it with forensic science all the time. There was a really powerful, I thought, report from the National Academy of Sciences that came out last year, really lambasting much of forensic science for having no scientific research basis. And even the fMRI-based lie detection. Now, I've talked to several of those investigators, two of whom are hooked up with private companies, and they say one of the reasons they're hooked up with private companies, that's the only way they can get money. NIH doesn't want to fund lie detection research. NSF doesn't want to fund lie detection research. CIA might want to fund lie detection research, but companies will fund that. What the NAS suggested was a National Institute for Forensic Science, I think that's what it was called. It would basically be an NIH model to fund important research on justice-related issues. This is a wonderful idea, and as a result, probably won't happen. At least not with budget constraints the way they are. But it is a wonderful idea. We need research, and there's nobody who really pays for it. There is a National Institute of Justice. It has a small, under the Department of Justice, it has a small research budget. Good luck breaking into it, but that might be a place to try. But remember, the other side of this is, even if you can find a funding agency, I do think they are antsy about research on criminality, biological-based research on criminality. Part of it is for the reasons I mentioned, of the fear of a backlash if somebody who's part of the research then does something bad. There's another really unfortunate, understandable but unfortunate reason for political reticence here.